Hi, everybody. Welcome to Kindred Skulls. I'm Matt Freese. I'm here with my co-host Nick Olson. Nick, how are we doing today?
Good. Enjoying the off season. No more tape to grind for the present moment until we get to the draft and start grinding all those prospect tapes but no NFL tape to grind at least. So enjoying the steady drip of news and the intrigue around free agents and the Aaron Rodgers saga. The season 3 or whatever of it is of Aaron Rodgers retirement watch. So yeah, it's been fun off season. How you been?
So what I took from that is clearly you're not grinding the tape on Brian Flores, which is a disappointment because we will eventually have a Flores defense episode. Uh, but we will get there as it goes on. In the meantime, I've actually, some personal news, started to write some articles for zone coverage. I do have a primer on the Flores defense. It's, I don't know, 8,000 words or something. So if reading's your thing, go ahead and check that out, and that'll probably sate you until we're able to put together a podcast. But no, seriously,
Or at least bookmark it right now and tell yourself you're going to read all 6 parts at some later point, and then once the season starts, it will actually. Joking aside, it's a really good reference to look back and see. In the same way that we went through the deep dive of the Fangio terminology, it'll be really helpful to understand once we get into the season, start talking about all these concepts. It's a really good resource, I think, to look back on. So.
yeah.
The podcast version is coming later, but yeah, like Matt mentioned, if you want the written version right now, there's a good summary up on from Matt from Zone Coverage in 5 parts. So
Yeah, so now that we ham-fisted that self-promotion into the episode, like you said, I think free agency is always an exciting time of year, right, for teams. This is the point in the season where no team gets worse, right? All 32 teams, all fans of all the teams convince themselves that they've gotten significantly better. So I'm excited to see how we do that for the Vikings and ourselves, right, as we go into this period. The Vikings do have a number of difficult decisions to make. We've already made one of those difficult decisions in cutting Eric Kendricks. I mean, I was sad on it. Like, Kendricks might be my favorite Viking, or he's at least in the top three, right? JJ's obviously up there, but Kendricks really, just kind of became the heart and soul of this defense, it seemed like, over the past few seasons, right? Both with, how he acted as a team leader off the field and on the field, kind of just his communication, kind of how he spoke out at the end of last season, right? The Zimmer regime didn't end on a great note, and he was kind of leading the charge for a person like Kevin O'Connell to come in, and a person who has Kevin O'Connell's demeanor. And I think that has clearly benefited the team, right? Obviously winning 13 games last year. So it's sad to see him go. The Vikings saved a ton of money by doing it, right? They saved $9 million against the cap this year with a very minimal, like $1 million+ dead cap hit. So from a financial perspective, it makes sense. From a team perspective, I do think it makes a little bit of sense. Obviously, he didn't play well in the Donatel scheme last year. I think that was more what the scheme was asking him to do than necessarily his play had completely fallen off a cliff. But Flores doesn't value off-ball linebackers all that highly, and he's in his defensive scheme either, right? You saw it in terms of the investment that he made into the Dolphins, which was minuscule in the guys that they had. And the off-ball linebacker that was valued in the Patriots system was Dante Hightower, who is a completely different body type and profile than what Kendricks is. So I do kind of see the reasons for moving on from him within that defense. But it just sucks overall. Like, I'm disappointed because he was one of my favorite players on the team.
yeah, as a fan, it's tough to see. We've sort of put turning over a new page with the old Zimmer regime that peaked in 2017. It's been tough losing Griffin, losing Kendricks, moving on from Rhodes, all these guys, walking off into the sunset. We'll see if Adam Thielen and Harrison Smith are also included in that group. I think it's interesting to see this as the first move because I would not, you would not have necessarily thought that Eric Kendricks was the automatic first cut on the list. I think what the Vikings were doing is it's similar to what happened with I would compare it to Michael Pierce last year,
Mm-hmm.
where I'm assuming they approached Eric Kendricks with a pay cut, and he said no, and the Vikings said, okay, we'll do you a solid and let you get a start really start on free agency that you can find somewhere else, test your market elsewhere. So we'll let you go first. So I don't think. I think there are other cuts on the roster, and we'll get into this, that are a little bit more obvious to make than Eric Kendricks. But I think, like with Michael Pierce, the Vikings approached Eric Kendricks and said, okay, if Kendricks turns this pay cut down, do we have somebody else in mind who could take his place? Do we have, with Michael Pierce, it was Harrison Phillips, who probably a downgrade from Michael Pierce when healthy, but also plays healthier and turned out to be a really good signing, because I think because Harrison Phillips was so healthy, yes, he was not that game wrecker that Pierce was, but because he was so much more consistent and didn't miss time, compared to what Pierce went through. It ended up being, not only did they save money, but I think they also upgraded at the spot in terms of when you can factor in like total snaps available as well. So I'm assuming they did the same thing with Kendricks. They have linebackers in mind that they assume will be cheaper than the $9 million that they saved with Eric Kendricks. So they sort of said, okay, we would prefer you to take a pay cut, but if not, here's our next best plan. We'll see, and we'll talk a little about who are some of these other linebackers who kind of fit the scheme better. And shout out to you, Matt, because this was the first thing you said when we hired Flores, was that Kendricks was one of the odd men looking out. He just doesn't exactly fit the body type, especially if they're going to roll with Asimo as you're in a 5-1 front. Asimo, you can get away with having him be the skinny guy up in the middle of the field, but you can't have the other guy needs to be able to take on offensive linemen, sort of. You mentioned Dante Hightower. Vikings fans might be a little more familiar with Anthony Barr. You need an Anthony Barr type guy who can take on offensive linemen and really be a kind of a hybrid edge type player. So, the writing was on the wall a little bit. So we'll see. But it'll be interesting to see who the front office sort of brings in as the replacement to Kendricks. And we can talk to Jordan Hicks. I don't think Hicks is the guy either. So
No.
We'll get into it a little bit.
Yeah. So, and one thing on that point where you mentioned, I think the leadership in the team does see a lot in Brian Asimo and likes his progress at the end of last year, and I think that probably is the impetus for that move. The Flores defense does, obviously they're not constantly playing in a 5-1 front, right? They have a variety of fronts, and they have two off-ball linebackers in a significant number of their looks. The thing is, that second off-ball linebacker is much more of a rotational piece than a true starter, right? So if they see Asamoah as the guy moving forward and the starter they want having that main role, it doesn't make a ton of sense to pay a guy like Eric Kendricks $10 million to kind of be a backup to play, 30 to 50% of the snaps, right? When you're paying a guy like Eric Kendricks $10 million a year, you want him playing close to 100% of the snaps, or at least 70 plus, 80 plus percent of the snaps in that sort of rotation there. So if the plan was for Asimo to take over, that makes sense. I still think Kendricks could have had value in this defense as that primary starter above Asamoah, and have Asamoah be the rotational guy as he develops into becoming a better NFL player going on, because I don't think he's a complete NFL player by any stretch at this point in his career, and that does concern me a little bit for the team moving forward. But with all of that being said, and we're going to get into it a little bit later, I do think there are options that'll fit the defense, be fine, and end up being a lot cheaper than Kendricks was if they need to play in a pinch. So, there's a give and take, and it's disappointing from the personal side of things, but it's an understandable move for the Vikings, especially considering that they need to get under the cap. And let's flip that over just to make it clear for everybody. Obviously, we're talking about these moves as they relate to the cap. The NFL has a salary cap. I think if you're listening to this podcast, you probably know that. It's set at roughly $220 million. There are some adjustments for teams, specifically depending on not likely to be earned incentives that were earned last year. Some adjustments based off of, I think, playtime and stuff for rookie players, or maybe that's more on the contract side. But, there are adjustments per each individual team in terms of stuff that's been rolled over as well. And the Vikings rolled over a very limited amount of cap from last season. So the Vikings, after the Eric Kendricks cut, are currently $15.78 million over the cap prior to free agency. They need to get under the cap before free agency begins, and the league year starts Wednesday. I believe it's March 15th. It's next Wednesday, based on when we're recording this on a Tuesday. At 4 p.m. is when the Vikings need to get to clear up that $15.78 million in cap space. So that's important to keep in mind, because any moves that they make after that, like for example, a post June 1st cut for a player, don't actually help them get under that cap space. You can't designate a post June 1st until after the league year begins, which means that they would have to cut any players now and take the full cap hit of their, accelerating bonus money, which we're going to get into some of this stuff, right? It's kind of technical, but they'd need to take that full brunt of that cap hit if they wanted to get under it. Now, I think probably the simplest way to get under the cap is to do what we'll refer to as simple restructures, right? Or salary money to bonus conversions. And I think, and I'm going to skip ahead on our list a little bit here, Nick, because I think we might want to talk about this first. There are two main contracts that the Vikings have that I think it makes sense to do this on. One is Brian ONeal, right, who's a long-term piece for the Vikings. He's under contract for a number of years, and I think the Vikings are happy with his performance. Obviously, he had the significant injury, but what this bonus conversion would do is take his salary this year, which is $14.4 million, and turn that into a signing bonus. So ONeal only gets so ONeal would only receive a $1 million salary, which is based off of how many years of service he has in the NFL. That's his league minimum salary. The rest of it becomes signing bonus. That signing bonus gets divided among the remaining years of his contract. So say that's roughly $13 million divided among 4 years. That's like something to the effect of $4 million a year. It's a little bit less than $4 million a year. Maybe $3.5 million is a better number, right? So $3.5 million applies this year, but the other $9+ million, almost $10 million applies in future years. So that saves you $10 million against the cap right there with that one action. And that's a little bit convoluted to hear without saying it on paper, so I'm not going to go through it again, but you can do that with ONeal, save $10 million. You can similarly do it with Kirk and save up to $20 million if you added all of his stuff together, changed it into a signing bonus, and he has 2 void years at the end of his contract. So that's without a Kirk extension. Nick, and again, we're going to get into a Kirk extension later, but do you have any qualms with doing that with ONeal or Kirk if the Vikings need to free up cap space in advance of free agency here?
Yeah, I mean, the reason teams don't just automatically do it is because it limits your optionality future down the road, makes it tougher to cut guys down the road. So as a player, it's obviously the players are always going to be happy having their salary converted to signing bonus because more than just being guaranteed, they get the money right away. Like as soon as, they just pay whenever the signing bonuses get paid out. So they get their money earlier. Not necessarily immediately when they sign the contract, but the money gets paid out earlier and becomes fully guaranteed. So players are always going to be happy to accept that. And usually the contracts will have it such that the team can just exercise an option automatically. So there's not even anything the player needs to accept. It's just to send them a notice, say, hey, we're activating the option in your contract or whatever. So the reason you wouldn't do it with ONeal is it would make you would be kind of tying yourself to him until his age 30-ish seasons. I don't think it's the first thing the Vikings would necessarily do if they can get cap compliant without necessarily tapping into that well. I think they would. But at the same time, I think ONeal, consistent Pro Bowl caliber right tackle, shows no signs of stopping. And I think you're confident in a player like him continuing to play well for the next few seasons. So I think. I think that's all just to say that I think there's a reason why they haven't done it already. But I also think like in terms of like least painful salary cap compliant moves, that's one of the easier ones to do. With Cousins, I wouldn't do it for the same reason that, the reason you do these salary to bonus conversions is with young players who are already on long contracts who you're comfortable committing to for future seasons as well. So Brian O'Neill is a perfect example. He's 26 or he's 27 years old, I think, right now, about to turn 28. And will be is already playing at a high level. You're comfortable committing to him long term. With Harrison Smith, you could save a lot of money converting Harrison Smith's salary into signing bonus, but you don't want to do that because you want to have the ability to get out of his contract once Harrison Smith starts to see an age decline. So, or you get into the position where you don't want to be paying Harrison Smith, $10 million plus in 2 years or something. So, with Cousins, you're starting to think about, okay, he's turning 35. Do we want to be on the hook for this contract, or do we want to be able to move him or cut him or move on from him? So I wouldn't necessarily do it. I wouldn't necessarily do a salary to bonus conversion with Cousins, but we can. I would consider if they do an extension. I think that's another way you can look at his contract, which is the biggest contract on the roster, and figure out a way to minimize his cap hit in 2023 to get within the cap. So. I wouldn't necessarily do it a salary to bonus conversion with Kirk. I would think about it with ONeal,
sure,
but not until I address some of the other easier cuts on the roster.
Yeah, so let's get into those potential cuts. I mean, who do you think? Give me two names who you think are the easiest cuts on the roster that the Vikings should end up cutting here, as we read into this. And if you don't think they need to cut two players, right? If you think we can do a restructure with a player, and let's be realistic about restructures, right? Like, I could talk about how Adam Thielen wants to stay in Minnesota and end his career in Minnesota all I want, but that doesn't mean I'm actually physically going to get him to, the Vikings are physically going to be able to get him to take less money to stay in Minnesota for the rest of his career. Same with Harrison Smith. So give me your two guys in terms of cutting that you're most willing to cut if you think we're going to have to cut up to two guys.
The two most obvious to me, I would say, are Jordan Hicks, and granted that's complicated by the fact that we already cut Eric Kendricks, but I think Jordan Hicks did not play at a starting caliber. Well, I would not project him to play at a starting caliber level going forward, and the Vikings can save over $5 million if they cut him for next season. So, or exactly $5 million. So I would cut Jordan Hicks and just sort of anoint Asimo as the guy, and try and find a replacement. I think you can find a replacement who would. That $5 million, I would say, is better applied even if you just try and find a linebacker. You're better using those $5 million to find another linebacker other than Jordan Hicks, who's not a bad player, but especially in this scheme, the only way Jordan Hicks could survive on an NFL roster is, a very like cover two heavy thing where he's just sort of dropping into his hook, and he can play that. He can still play the run really well. He diagnoses well. But he's not somebody you want to man up. I mean, we saw this in the Cowboys game. Tony Pollard, you do not want Jordan Hicks matching up against, like tight ends, much less wide receivers. And, that's something that teams are going to continue to exploit the same way they did last year against Jordan Hicks. So I feel like, especially with the move to a Brian Flores offense, Hicks is sort of an odd man out, even without Eric Kendricks on the roster. The other guy I would say is CJ Ham. I feel like the writing is up a little bit on the wall for him. You'd only save $3 million cutting him, but Kevin O'Connell, we kind of knew going into last year that this is going to be a Ram-style 11 personnel offense. 11 personnel usage shot up from one of the least used formations under Kubiak to one of the most used formations in the league. So Vikings were, I think, top 5 in 11 personnel usage. CJ Ham's total snap count dropped from being in the low 400s, high 300s to less than half of that. So there's a role for CJ Ham on someone else's roster, somebody who likes to use sort of that old school I formation lead blocking scheme. I don't think that's necessarily where Kevin O'Connell wants to take the offense, and I don't think CJ Ham is worth justifying $3 million to a guy who's primarily a good special teamer. But I feel like his skill set you could replace. And I also, as much as we love CJ Ham, I feel like he's not a Kyle Juszczyk. He's not like a difference maker where you need to get this guy on the field because he's one of your six best skill players or whatever, your 5 best skill players. I'm not taking snaps away from KJ Osborne. I'm not taking away snaps from, if it's Irv Smith or Johnny Munt or whoever. I'm not taking snaps away from Johnny Munt just to get CJ Ham more snaps because CJ Ham is that much better than those guys. So I feel like Ham, as much as he's been a great Viking, a local Minnesota legend, I think it's also the end of the road him, because I just don't see him justifying that $3 million when you could go out and spend it on some other role player for the roster.
Yeah, and that combination is functionally all you need to get the Vikings under the cap if we go back to the ONeal bonus conversion that we talked about before, right? Because Hicks saves you $5 million against the cap. I fully agree with saying the Vikings should move on from Jordan Hicks. I don't think he provides the value of a starting linebacker, and you're paying him $5 million, and you can cut that pretty easily with, again, very little in the way of dead cap. I think it's just over $1 million in dead cap for Hicks as well. With that being said, the Vikings at that point would need to bring a linebacker in, but I think there are linebackers on the open market who are looking like they're going to get roughly that $5 million range. So I think you can make a 1-to-1 replacement once you get under the cap, and then maybe you can move some more money around in other ways. In terms of cutting CJ Ham, I don't disagree with you in terms of the offensive utility. I think the special teams probably matters to the Vikings a little more than we think. And if we mix a little bit of recent reporting that's gone in here, I think it was Andrew Kramer from the Star Tribune basically said he's not expecting any movement on CJ Ham. I think he also said he's not expecting any movement on Dalvin Cook, and he's not expecting Cook to necessarily take a pay cut. What he was saying is that I correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if you've seen this report, but he says there's some expectation that Harrison Smith might take a pay cut to stay with the Vikings, and it's looking less likely that Thielen would take a pay cut to stay with the Vikings. So Smith, Thielen, and Dalvin Cook are the big ticket items for the Vikings in terms of players that they could cut, and players that A, have large cap hits, right, and B, save them money if they actually cut them, right? So Adam Thielen, if you cut him this year, saves you $6.4 million against the cap. If you cut him post June 1st, which, like we talked about, we need to free up money before we made this cut, you can save $13.4 million. And if anybody remembers Kyle Rudolph being cut post June 1st, that extra $6+ million you get with the $13.4 million, or it's actually $7 million exactly, does not actually apply until after June 1st, right? So it's not quite as valuable as getting it right away at the start of free agency, where you can basically sign whoever you want. Harrison Smith, you save $7.4 million right away, or $15.2 million post June 1st. Dalvin Cook, you save $5.9 million or $9 million post June 1st. And I believe that $5.9 million does include the $2 million guaranteed for injury, which he's probably got guaranteed because he had shoulder surgery. If it doesn't, then it's only a paltry $3.9 million. The other player who's a question is Zadarius Smith, who's another one of our edge rushers, obviously, who you could save $12.1 million if you move on from him, but that's not something I personally want to do because A, his cap hit is only $14 million, right? There's very little dead cap in that contract, but $14 million for a player of Zadarius Smith's caliber last season is a very good deal. Harrison Smith and Adam Thielen are both making about $19 million they're both costing about $19 million against the cap this year, right? I'd much rather do something with that or do something with Dalvin's contract, which I think is somewhere around $13 million, but he's a running back, right? Running backs simply aren't that valuable. I don't think we're getting value on Dalvin's contract. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and I think the thing that shapes all of this is what did the Vikings do if they cut this player and they try and replace him with somebody else on the open market? That's why I think Harrison Smith is likely to take a pay cut because right now, Harrison Smith is what, like 33? And you look at the safety market right now, or he's 34, he's turning 34. You look at the safety market right now, and there just aren't that many safeties making a lot of money on the open market right now. Like you got the Derwin James types approaching cornerback money because he's really more of a cornerback than something. But that's not really Harrison Smith. Otherwise, you've got like the Jamal Adams and the Minkas making 17, 18. But other than that, it's a lot of safeties making 10, 12, 13 million dollars. So I feel like. Not to mention, safeties are one of the more fungible positions. It's easier to find them on the open market. So I feel like you could find a safety on the open market. And if you cut Harrison Smith, he's not going to get, a $10+ million contract on the open market at this point. So I think it's you can approach Harrison Smith and say, look, we could cut you. We would prefer not to, but we think, like here's the situation, here's the leverage is if we cut you, you're not going to get as much money as we are contractually obligated to pay you. So we'll meet in the middle somewhere and get you to come along. It's a little different when you're talking about Adam Thielen, for example, because wide receiver contracts have just ballooned in the last year and a half. So there are wide receiver twos who are getting over $20 million a year. So you look at Adam Thielen. If I'm Adam Thielen's agent, I'm fighting back against like any suggestion that I would take a pay cut because look, like there's a good chance that somebody will give Adam Thielen more money if the Vikings cut him. So I just feel like it's a little less likely that Thielen stomachs a pay cut, because there's an argument that, even at his age, and even though maybe athletically he's dropped off or he isn't getting as open as he used to, which you could quibble with. I think he's definitely not as good as he was in his prime, when he was an All Pro. But I also think, like, the rumors of his demise have been a little exaggerated. So I think that's kind of the driving. And, to take it to another level, Zadarius Smith. I mean, you cut Zadarius Smith, he's probably getting a pay raise unless he's like, the Vikings have a very, very reasonable contract. They got him at a discount because they signed him when he was coming off a season-ending injury. So even though the Vikings could save over $12 million if they cut Zadarius Smith, then you're going from a Pro Bowl player to DJ Wanham. You're going from a guy with double-digit sacks and was one of the highest player with one of the most pressures in the NFL despite missing a game, to a replacement level player. As much as I've stand DJ Wanham over the years. So I just that's not making your team better. Cutting Adam Thielen and trying to find like a DJ Chark type, I'm not sure that's an upgrade, and I'm not sure that saves you any money. Cutting Harrison Smith and finding another, safety on the veteran, like a Javon Holland or something, reuniting with Brian Flores, like that probably, you could argue, you could squint and see how that maybe makes the team better, or at least saves them some money. So I think it all is kind of dictated by where the NFL market is right now, and that's why I think, like, Harrison Smith is likely to accept a pay cut. Thielen a little less likely. Zadarius Smith, I would be surprised if they touch that contract, just because I feel like it's a good deal for the Vikings.
Yeah, and you combine that $5 million from Hicks, and let's say Adam Thielen, like, it's difficult, but if the Vikings do tend to move on from him, right, you have some in-house options that you like. I don't think they'd cut Thielen and then replace him with a high-level free agent, right? They'd try to go into the bargain basement of wide receivers who become available, or they'd try to do something in the draft to replace that level of production, I think, if you're moving on from Adam Thielen. But Thielen does save you $6.4 million off against the cap if you do that immediately. You add that to Hicks' $5 million, and you get to $11.5 million roughly. Now you only need about $4 million to get under the cap, and you can do that more easily with the bonus conversions, right? Where, okay, now I'm not moving all of ONeal's salary, but I'm moving some of it, and that's helping me free up space into the future while also maintaining future flexibility. Just something I wanted to mention is there are a couple other players that, the Vikings could move on from and save at least a decent amount of money. DJ Wanham, who you mentioned as an example, he's in the last year of his deal. I don't think he's something that the Vikings should look to move on from, because I don't think the cap benefit is all that good, and I think he was okay as a rotational piece last year. That's also true for Cameron Dantzler. That's true for Chris Reed. But again, you're not going to find guys on the market who are able to give you the value that those players, I think, gave you as somewhat playable pieces, right? I'm not going to come out on a limb and say that they're bona fide starters, any of the three of them at their positions, but they're at least depth pieces who you feel okay putting on the field, and you're only saving $2.7 million. Ross Blacklock, who is somebody the Vikings traded for, is a $1.7 million cap hit. There's no dead money on that contract if the Vikings were to cut him. One of the reasons I wanted to bring him up, though, is that $1.7 million savings is a little bit deceptive, because his $1.7 million gets replaced with a minimum contract player, right? As it comes to salary cap accounting. So that minimum contract is probably somewhere in the $700,000 or $800,000 range. So while the over the cap chart says, which is where I got all this data, by the way, over the cap's great. It is the best resource for player contracts, in my opinion. While it says $1.7 million, you're actually saving $1 million against that, because the next highest guy now comes into the cap accounting there. So, you can nickel and dime moves to help you a little bit, but at what cost, right, in terms of the depth to the team? So I think we're looking at big fish, and then we'd be looking at contract restructures and potential extensions, like a TJ Hawkinson extension or something like that. So with the extensions, why don't we flip into it, right? And why don't we talk about the big one first? Kirk Cousins obviously has a big cap hit this year. It's in the $35 million range. And next year, he's going to become a free agent if the Vikings don't do anything. There was a report that it sounded like the Vikings would not do another 1 year, another single year extension with Kirk Cousins like they did last season. So it's either they're going to let him play out his contract or do a new long-term extension. So Nick, I guess the two questions are, A, is a long-term extension a good idea for Kirk Cousins? And B, what kind of structure would you expect from that long-term extension? And how much cap would it end up saving us this year, potentially, if we did it that way?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I feel like it's one that's continuing to shift as we've seen some of these new quarterback contracts get handed out. Notably Geno Smith just the other day, and then today, we're recording on Tuesday, it was announced that Daniel Jones had agreed to a contract extension with the Giants. So,
and
in
Derek
light of those
Carr
things,
as well.
Derek Carr as well. So, all of these contracts are coming in well below the Russell Wilsons, and not that maybe because of how the Russell Wilson contract has so far not worked out, but below Patrick Mahomes, below the Deshaun Watson, another example of a contract that maybe it hasn't gotten off to where they wanted it to. But I had sort of been used to seeing quarterbacks come in and just, every quarterback beats the last. So it's just kind of the quarterback market right now is 45 million. Well, my guy wants 46 million, and then next year, well, my guy wants 47 million, and that's sort of what we've seen. And now we're starting to see players come in and say like, okay, well, I'm not Patrick Mahomes, so I'm not going to get a Patrick Mahomes size contract. So it's interesting to see, if the Vikings could get Kirk Cousins for a Geno Smith size contract, or even a Derek Carr size contract, that would be a lot more appealing than having to extend Kirk for $45 million a year over 4 years or 5 years or something. So, which is, that's not quite what Daniel Jones got, but Daniel Jones with incentives probably could get there. So I think Daniel Jones was base 4 years, 160 million. Derek Carr was what, 3 years or 4 years, 150 million. So it's a little bit below.
And one thing that I think is important to point out of a distinction between Kirk and these contracts is like in both the Derek Carr contract and the Geno Smith contract. The Geno Smith was a 3-year deal. The Carr was a 4-year, $150 million. The last 2 years of that Carr deal are funny money. The Carr deal is essentially 2 years, $35 million per year, because he's got $60 million in the first 2 years. And then before the second year of the contract, so like in roughly this time frame next year, he gets a $10 million roster bonus for the third year of the contract guaranteed, but he's also got like $40 million in unguaranteed salary that year and a $50 million cap hit, which seems unlikely to ever happen, right? And I know the Saints play cap shenanigans year after year after year. The final year of Carr's contract has a $50 million cap hit, which just seems utterly ridiculous to me, right? I don't think that's realistic at all. So at the end of the day, they are playing with a little bit of funny money in these contracts. The Daniel Jones contract, he does get 2 years, $82 million guaranteed within the first 2 years. So I think that's more of a realistic $40 million a year contract. I'd be interested to see what the final 2 years of that contract are. I don't know if we have the full details on that yet. But, Kirk, with his propensity for wanting more fully guaranteed contracts, I think he'd probably lean more towards the APY of Derek Carr, with the benefit being that he gets the financial security of a fully guaranteed deal, right? So if you get a 4-year deal at $35 million a year, what does that turn into? $140 million, something like that?
4 years at 40 million, 160.
Or 4 years of 40 million is 160. At 35 would be 140. So if he splits the difference in there, that becomes 150, right? Which is like Carr's APY. But if he gets that fully guaranteed instead of having like a bunch of funny money at the end of the contract like Carr does, I think that puts him in a better position than Carr is in terms of a contract. And I think Carr is a better comparison than Daniel Jones, just given the age difference, right? Daniel Jones is coming off of his rookie deal. Carr is in a similar spot, albeit a couple years younger than Kirk Cousins is.
Yeah, and Cousins will probably look at the Daniel Jones contract and see that as sort of. I think both sides will look at that as the most useful precedent. If this
Hmm.
were you're buying a home, that's the comp that's probably closest to the one. So that's the one where that one might affect the valuation the most. Even though Cousins isn't necessarily coming on, he's not a young player, he's not ascending like Daniel Jones. I think Cousins will look at that and say like, well, yeah, but I'm better than Derek Carr is. So. Maybe the Vikings will point to the Derek Carr contract before you even get to you get to the negotiating table about a Cousins extension. I think you also have to think about, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah talked at his press conference the other day about really, wanting optionality at the quarterback position. And so I think locking yourself into a long-term deal with Kirk Cousins forecloses the possibility of trading up for a rookie quarterback or finding another journeyman quarterback on the free agency market, as we're starting to see decent quality quarterbacks become available, whether that's Jimmy Garoppolo or whether that's somebody else on the trade market or somebody else in the free agency. We just saw the Seahawks have a lot of success bringing in Geno Smith, so maybe they want to try something like that. Or we can talk a little bit about Lamar Jackson and his very unique situation where he is now able to negotiate a new contract with another team, and the Ravens have sort of a right of first refusal to that contract. So, yeah, a lot of different ways they could go with that. The Vikings could save a lot of money. Right now, Kirk Cousins has a $10 million salary plus a $20 million roster bonus. So if you sign him to an extension, you can kind of reduce those down to zero. Plus on top of whatever else bonus is, and you push all the money off to future years. Kind of like what you would do if you were doing a salary to bonus conversion. So you could save probably close to $20 million with the Kirk Cousins extension, just in terms of 2023 cap dollars. Obviously, you're going to be paying that money in future years, but if you want to get cap compliant, that's the easiest way to do it, is just sort of give Cousins a lot of money and make sure most of it is backloaded to the other years. So if you wanted to, that's sort of part of the appeal. But the problem is you're locking yourself into Kirk Cousins. And the question with Kirk Cousins is always going to be like, yes, he's consistently very healthy. He does a lot of things great, but does he give you the ceiling that's high enough to win Super Bowls? So that's kind of where I am with Kirk.
Yeah, and that's a question the Vikings have to answer for themselves, right? And I don't think we need to relitigate the whole Kirk Cousins mess, right? In terms of, like, does he deserve a contract? That's been beaten to death over the course of the past 5 years since he's been a Viking, right? So we'll table that for now and just let you guys have the options. We can talk about whether or not Kirk Cousins deserves an extension when we see whether or not he gets another extension, right? I think that's probably a more appropriate time to look at it. So the next player on the list is TJ Hawkinson. And TJ Hawkinson currently has about a $9 million cap hit, approaching $10 million for the 2023 season. This is the fifth-year option year for Hawkinson on his, original rookie deal. It's all salary and it's all guaranteed because that's the way the rookie fifth-year option works, right? So a TJ Hawkinson extension, I think, is something the Vikings are incentivized to do, right? We gave up draft capital for him. B, I think it makes a lot of sense for them to do, right? Hawkinson played extremely well last season once he got into the role. You can even look at his performance in the playoff game. You can look at his performance, in that second to last week of the season. Where he had, or both Giants games, right? He had a ton of catches. He was super useful over the middle. He kind of opened a dimension to the Vikings passing game that they didn't previously have as a guy who could run up the seam and be a tight end. He's a very good blocker as a tight end. Like, I think he's very clearly worth a contract extension. And extending Hawkinson can easily reduce that cap number, right? A typical extension would be you give him a bunch of guaranteed bonus money up front. You make that first year salary, once again, the minimum salary, as we talked about before. And at that point, you could give him, something absurd, like up to a $40 million signing bonus before he starts costing more against the cap than he did this past season, right? So, if you give him, let's say $30 million guaranteed at signing on a potential contract in the form of a signing bonus, and make it a 4-year extension, say, like, let's just, for me to make the math easy, if you give him a $30 million signing bonus, that's a $32 million guaranteed extension. I don't know how that stacks up to other tight end extensions, but I think that's actually a really good number for a tight end extension, right? You divide that over, or let's say $30 million, it's a 4-year extension. You divide that $30 million by 5 years, that's $6 million a year. You add one, you save $2 million against the cap by doing that, and that's giving him a ton of money in terms of a signing bonus, right? So I think it's very easy to do that extension and save money against the cap. Is kind of what I'm getting at there. Do you disagree with that, or you think it's kind of a no-brainer to do that extension like I do?
Oh yeah, totally. I think you look at Hawkinson and you try. I mean, the thing with Hawkinson is the tight end market is so wonky right now that Pro Bowl tight ends who are functionally wide receiver ones or wide receiver twos are getting paid like wide receiver threes. So I mean, George Kittle is getting paid $15 million a year. Granted that he signed that extension back in 2020, so it's a little bit old by now. But at the same time, he's still the second highest paid tight end. The only one paid more is Darren Waller. Travis Kelce, who's arguably, you could make an argument that he's a top 10 wide receiver, including tight ends in the league. He probably is, considering everything he does for the Chiefs, or at least he was last year. He's 34 or whatever now. But Kelce is not making $15 million a year, and yeah, age plays into that a little bit. So I'm sure T.J. Hawkinson will say like, yeah, but I'm 10 years younger than Kelce was, and Kittle signed his contract 3 years ago, so I'd like to exceed that. But at the same time, if you end up paying Hawkinson 16, $17 million over 4 years or something, or as an average over 5 years, I think that's still a very team-friendly contract when you compare it to the Mike Williamses of the world getting $20 million per year. I think Hawkinson is a better receiver than those guys. Not that you necessarily want to compare it to like the worst contracts of the wide receiver twos of the world, but it's just a way to show that like Hawkinson's a Pro Bowl player who does a lot of really great things as a receiver, and he's functionally, after the trade, became the go-to wide receiver too. When Justin Jefferson wasn't open or when things weren't working, Hawkinson got fed like 10 plus targets in some of those games. So, I think you happily look at Hawkinson and give him a contract structure similar to Kittle or something like that, where he instantly becomes the second highest paid tight end in the league. Even if you make him the highest paid tight end in the league, I still think that's team friendly just because of the weird way that the tight end market is right now. And I think that's part of the reason why Kwesi Adofo-Mensah pulled the trigger on this trade, because he knew that there's a market inefficiency right now where you can arbitrage tight ends and get them at a better value for the team than it is to try and find a wide receiver too. Like it's a sort of a weird situation where Adam Thielen is getting paid more than T.J. Hawkinson, despite the fact that or has will have a higher cap hit, despite the fact that Hawkinson is clearly a much more valuable player.
Yeah. So there's a couple players we haven't talked about so far. One is Danielle Hunter. The other is Justin Jefferson, who are also in line for potential extensions for different reasons. Obviously, Justin Jefferson is like the best receiver in the NFL, is going to get paid a ton of money. It sounds like by the Vikings. Both Kwesi Adofo-Mensah and Kevin O'Connell were effusive about Jefferson and basically said they're going to lock him up to a long-term extension in their press conferences at the Combine. Danielle Hunter is an interesting case because obviously with the previous regime under Rick Spielman, they did an interesting thing with his contract by putting a lot of the money into the 2022 season, and he's getting paid only about $5 million to play for the Vikings in 2023. He has a large cap number that's mostly, or it's in the $15 million range. That's mostly prorated bonus money based off of that contract. And that puts him in a really interesting spot because the Vikings can't save any money at all if they cut him. Like, I don't even think they save money if they post June 1st cut him. So it's really difficult to trade or cut Danielle Hunter this season. And that also makes an extension a little bit complicated because you basically can't save money if you extend him. One other player it's worth talking about is Dalvin Tomlinson, whose contract was set to void, but the Vikings actually changed the date that it would void. So I don't think we've heard anything since then on a potential Dalvin Tomlinson extension for the Vikings. But Nick, what do you think about extending Dalvin Tomlinson? Obviously, there's a reason the Vikings moved out the void date for that contract. They wanted more time to negotiate with him.
So if the Vikings agree to an extension, right now, if Tomlinson's contract voids, they incur the signing bonus acceleration. So instead of having a $2.5 million dead cap hit, he would have a $7.5 million dead cap hit because the signing bonus prorations from 2024 and 2025 would accelerate and get charged all at once to 2023. So you don't want that to happen. And Tomlinson and his camp were kind enough to agree to push out that it was set to void a couple weeks back, and they agreed to extend it out to March 15th, I believe. And I don't think Thompson, they had to agree to amend the contract, which both parties have to agree to. I don't think Tomlinson would agree to amend the contract to push out his void date, because it's not something that helps Tomlinson. So I think the only reason they do that is because they're making good progress on an extension, and I think it would make sense to extend Tomlinson because because I don't think it's pretty slim pickings at the interior defensive linemen in free agency and in the draft a little bit too. I don't think you're likely to upgrade on Dalvin Thompson. Darren Payne with the Commanders was franchise tagged. There's a couple other guys, the Hargreave and Raymond Jones out of Denver. But I think Tomlinson is probably better than Jones, and even if he's not the best fit for Flores' scheme, I think he's a really good player, and you can find room for really good players. So I think it makes sense to try and extend Tomlinson, and then you add on top of the fact that if the Vikings were to extend Tomlinson, then that dead cap hit goes from 7.5 million back to 2.5 million. So essentially, you get $5 million of instant 2023 cap money to play with. You just convert that immediately into a salary for 2023, and that gets you, I think, a lot of the way there. In fact, there would be a way to structure a Dalvin Thompson extension that would actually save the Vikings money for the 2023 season compared to just letting his contract void and letting him be a free agent. So I think there's an incentive on both sides, both on the football field and looking just at the salary cap spreadsheets, that it makes a lot of sense to try and work something out with Thompson, which is exactly why I think both parties agreed to amend his contract and give themselves a little bit more breathing rooms to pound something out before the deadline in about a week.
Yeah, totally on board with that. I think you're right. And I think it's actually really simple for the Vikings to be able to come up with a contract extension that saves them at least a little bit of money in 2023 against the Caps, as opposed to letting his contract void. So that is something I'm on board with doing. So why don't we flip it over a little bit and get into a little bit of a free agent preview, right? I mean, obviously, we're not reading tea leaves or anything here. We don't have any inside information in terms of who the Vikings might be in on, right? But there's going to be some educated guesses based off of, what Flores has done in the past. All of the Patriots guys always love to bring Patriots guys with them when they get a new job, so I think we're going to expect some of that. But I think first it's important to address some of the Vikings' needs, and we can go over this pretty quickly one by one, just in terms of saying, give a position. Is it a need? How high priority is the need, right? So, like quarterback, I think that it's not a need. We have Kirk Cousins, right? If we are going to do something, it would be a massive swing for a player like Lamar Jackson, or it'd be something in the draft for a quarterback of the future. Do you disagree with that, Nick?
No, I agree with that.
Okay, yeah. So running back is, if we keep Dalvin Cook, I think not an immediate need. If we decide to move on from Dalvin Cook, it becomes an immediate need, right? So I don't think we're going to look at running backs right now because we expect the Vikings to probably keep Dalvin Cook.
Yeah, I agree. We didn't necessarily touch on it, but I do think, when I said, who was more likely to take a pay cut than others, I would put Dalvin Cook closer to Harrison Smith just based on the running back market right now than I would put him to, say, Zadarius Smith. So I feel like there's a chance maybe Cook takes a pay cut, or maybe the Vikings approach him about one, because certainly if you look at last year's advanced metrics, or you look at the film, I think the vision, the footwork, all that's still there, but the burst maybe isn't. And if that's starting to slow down, maybe you rethink about, do you want to keep Dalvin Cook as the fourth highest paid running back in the league or whatever. So, but yeah, assuming the reporting is right that Cook is going to be on the roster this year, it doesn't make sense to invest in the position, especially even with Madison leaving. They got some good young guys coming up back behind him. So I'm pretty confident in the stable of Cook as the first guy there.
Yeah. So. Wide receiver, I mean, we talked about potentially losing Adam Thielen. I think that does become a need, but I don't think that's something that we would address via a high priced or like a significant free agent. Would you agree on that?
Yeah, I think the Vikings would hope that Keenan McCardell can prove his worth and maybe make something out of Jalen Naylor or Jalen Rager. You don't want either of those guys to be penciled in as the wide receiver 3, but just given the state of both the draft, I think doesn't seem like it's the best wide receiver draft especially compared to some of the most recent seasons. But also looking at free agency, like part of the, because the NFL all of a sudden decided they love wide receivers and want to pay them as much as quarterbacks. The end result is it's not a great
There's,
wide receiver market
yeah.
because all of them have already been signed. So um, it would be a need, but not one that we would necessarily expect to address. So.
Yeah, a tight end. I mean, I don't think it's a need for us. First of all, obviously, I think we just sung TJ Hawkinson's praises. It's not something we look to invest significantly in free agency at all. Offensive tackle, similarly, not a need, right? You got Christian Darrisaw, you got Brian O'Neill anchoring both sides of the line of scrimmage. Not worried about that. Interior offensive line, becomes a bit more of a question, especially if Garrett Bradbury is a free agent. I would classify that as a need. It's something I'd probably rather address in free agency myself than in the draft. Do you agree on that, Nick?
Yeah, I think there are some good centers available. I think Bradbury, obviously, but Ethan
Mm-hmm.
Posick. There's it's not the worst time to look at a center. Centers is a position kind of like safety or kind of like nickelback, where the NFL doesn't value them very much. So you can often find solid starting caliber players at those positions and not have to break the bank for them. So, and bringing back Bradbury is always an option as well. So I feel like it makes sense to try and find a center. As far as guard, they're probably going to give Ed Ingram more opportunities, and Ezra Cleveland is still under contract. He may or may not get an extension, but I think for right now, you focus on figuring out center, and you leave the guards to be figured out in 2024 and see how things go with 2023 to see if Cleveland and Ingram are going to be part of the long term plan.
Yeah, and I pretty much agree with you. There's not really a name on the list that I have strong convictions about one way or another for the interior offensive line, right? Like, there's a bunch of guys out there. Connor McGovern, Justin Britt, Austin Blythe, who was somebody, we were kind of interested in probably a couple of years ago. Garrett Bradbury's on there. But there's just not a name that sticks out as somebody I want the Vikings specifically to target or go after. So I don't think we're going to spend that much time on it right now. And it's kind of a wait and see what they'll do, and then we'll evaluate it after the fact. If we flip over to the defensive side of the ball, we'll go with interior defensive line. To me, I think Khair Sanga's been a great find. I think Harrison Phillips is awesome. I think if we're able to extend Dalvin Tomlinson, this is not a need at all, right? It's not something that we really need to strongly consider investing heavily in free agency. And if we were to invest in it, even with just Tonga and Phillips, I'd rather look to the draft to fill this position than I think the free agent market.
Yeah, fully agree. I would say all these guys are all really good, but they're all primarily run stuffers.
Mm-hmm.
Tonga is a true nose. Tomlinson is probably better off as a nose or a run plugging type 4-eye or 3 tech rather than a gap shooting 3 tech. And Phillips is obviously more of a nose as well. So you kind of got 3 run pluggers. And Flores' system, especially when he likes to get blitz heavy, you want to have guys who can penetrate, shoot gap. So that's still, I wouldn't call it a need, but in an ideal world, long term, you find a way to hit guys with a little bit more gap shooting ability, pass rush juice. So, but again, wouldn't call it a need. Maybe you can hopefully find a rotational guy who can do that when you're in pass downs.
Yeah, and edge rusher, I'm not going to call a need necessarily, although I think, like you mentioned for that, there is a body type on the Vikings defense that I think they are probably going to look at adding, right? Like, under Flores, he's always had kind of that undersized edge rusher, whether it's a Kyle Van Noy, like you mentioned earlier, whether it's a Jamie Collins, right, back in New England, or whether it's Andrew Van Ginkel, who was there with Miami. And while I don't want to move on from Hunter or Za'Darius Smith, we've talked about not wanting to move on from either of them. I think that body type, somebody who can drop back in coverage a little bit more fluidly, is something the Vikings might look to. Andrew Van Ginkel's a free agent. Honestly, I think there's probably a pretty high likelihood that the Vikings bring him in. Do you have any other names in that body type that you think the Vikings might bring in?
Van Ginkel, obviously one of them. I wouldn't call him an edge, but Van Noy's available, and he has familiar. He
Yep.
was with Flores in New England when they won the Super Bowl. He was his linebackers coach then, and then he also brought him into Miami. Had to cut him after the first year because of kind of COVID crunch the salary cap. So he was a cap casualty. So maybe I don't know how happy he is with Brian Flores after but then again
Sure.
he got his money. So and Van Noy, his play hasn't dropped off a ton necessarily. He's more of like if you talk about him as a line, he's like a big linebacker, but he's not necessarily an edge player. But he is somebody who I think could take on offensive linemen. So there's some guys who can kind of fit in there. I do think I wouldn't call edge rusher or pass rusher a need because of right now they have Hunter and Zadarius Smith. I don't think they will necessarily have Zadarius Smith in 2024 just because you don't want to have to rely on his health. And the same thing with Danielle Hunter. I do think you're planning on Danielle Hunter being the guy, but I do think it's probably a good idea to start thinking about long term who are going to be, what's the succession plan here. It's a premium position, so you need to think about it in advance. Would not surprise me if they don't end up trading up to take a quarterback or something, if they stay put and they take the best edge rusher, pass rusher available at 23.
Yeah. So moving on from edge, and a guy like Van Ginkel or Van Noy is a hybrid edge linebacker, but we'll move into the linebacker position. The Vikings literally created a need this week by cutting Eric Kendricks at this position, I think. I do think it's something they have to fill. I'd like to fill it through a veteran, through free agency, and then maybe taking a long-term view, draft a guy who has freaky height, weight, and speed in the draft at the linebacker position you think can be an off-ball thumper, and go down to the edge, kind of like Dante Hightower did. Now, obviously, that might be a very high investment player in the draft. It might not be something they have the capital to do this season, but it is something long-term I'd like to see them try to do to try to match that physicality and that profile there. If we go into the free agent linebacker core, there are a number of guys there. I'm going to be looking at the bargain basement, right? And one guy who, on the very high range of things, could fit in that role is Tremaine Edmonds, right? He's a very big, long player. Obviously, he's maybe a bit more coverage focused, but he's probably going to cost, in the range of $20 million a year. And I don't want to spend that on a linebacker at all. So he's kind of off of my wish list in terms of somebody I'd want. Players I would expect are Duke Riley and Denzel Perriman, both former Dolphins players, both played under Brian Flores in Miami. Like I mentioned earlier, the Patriots guys love to bring those guys around. They love to bring them in, help teach the system, and they're bargain basement players, right? Landon Roberts was a former Patriots guy who Flores brought to Miami as a bargain basement player. He was a starter for 3 or 4 years now in Miami, right? Because Flores liked him and he played well enough. That's the type of guy to replace Kendricks and maybe help Brian Asimo along that I'd like to see the Vikings bring in rather than go for a big name splash free agent. Do you have any other names on the linebacking group that you think might be a value add for the Vikings?
No, and I fully agree with your strategy. I think it makes sense to try and maybe on day 2 or high up in day 3 find a developmental prospect. I feel like that's usually a sweet spot where you can find athletes who are too young or too raw or still need some incubation time. And then you try and get one of these cheap old vets who are cheap because they are old, and get them on like a 1-year deal. So I like the names you threw out there in addition to Van Noy.
Yeah, so if we move on, I'm going to skip corner for now because it's going to be probably the longer conversation. But to safety, I mean, the Vikings are very heavily invested in safety, right? We drafted Lewisine in the first round last year. We have Harrison Smith on the large contract. We don't expect Harrison Smith to get cut. And at that point, I don't consider safety much of a need at all. And even if Harrison Smith does get cut, Cam Bynum, I think, gets a little bit more of a bad rap than he deserves. Like, I don't think he played super great last year, but I think there is some level of a starter in there. And, Flores uses a ton of 3 safety systems, right? So the Patriots defense has a propensity for using like a big dime, right? Where you have 3 safeties and 3 corners as opposed to, just 4 cornerbacks and 2 safeties. And I think Bynum can play a deep safety role in those packages if you ask him to. So I don't consider safety a huge need for the Vikings. I think the guys that they have the versatility that's required to play in this defense, at least in terms of Harrison Smith and Scene. Obviously that changes if the Vikings cut Harrison Smith, but it's not something I'd expect them to spend major capital on in free agency.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if they wanted to, bring Devin McCourty back and reunite him with Brian Flores, McCourty, I think, is what 36 now, but he's still playing at a high enough level. So with the opportunity for additional safety snaps, especially if you're not confident in Bynum or you have questions about Lewis's health and availability, it could make some sense. But yeah, I feel like they're pretty set there.
Yeah, and then finally corner. I mean, I think we both agree corner is a huge need and the Vikings' biggest need. I would like to see the Vikings address corner primarily through free agency, although I'd really like to see them address it both through free agency and the draft, right? Like, I think you get a guy who you think can play right away in free agency, and then you get a guy in the draft who, you think can be a long-term player for you. Because the Vikings simply don't have anybody I'm convinced is a quality starter on the roster right now, right? Our rostered corners are Cameron Dantzler, right, who we mentioned a little bit earlier, Andrew Booth Jr., and Caleb Evans. That's it. That's the list, right? We've got some futures guys, but not even Duke Shelley, I believe, is under contract with the Vikings right now, right? So it's something they have to strongly consider going into free agency. What names top your list for the Vikings in terms of corners that they might bring in?
I mean, it could always make sense to bring back Patrick Peterson. I think the question I have for him is he's slimmed down so much since his press man days. He used to be the prototypical,
Mm-hmm.
Brian Flores type quarterback, and now he's just so much lighter that I'm not sure you necessarily, he played at over 220 coming out, and now he's at like 180 or something. So he's lost. Do you trust somebody like that to still jam press? And we've seen that he can, get beaten deep. So he wouldn't necessarily be my first choice. A guy that I really like is Jonathan Jones, both because of the Flores connection, but also because I feel like he has inside-outside versatility. And with the Vikings right now, do not have a slot cornerback on the roster. I mean, all the guys we mentioned, Andrew Booth, Cam Dantzler. Booth is I think primarily outside. Dantzler is you really don't want him inside, and Evans I think you do not want inside either. So really, I think Jonathan Jones would have the ability to sort of play a lot, familiarity with the system, and also I think he's an above-average slot corner. And because he's a slot corner and not an outside corner, I feel like the Vikings could get him for a pretty good deal as well. So all those reasons, he's probably one of my top targets. Also because I feel like they're going to be priced out of the James Bradburys or the Jamal Deans of the world.
Yeah, and I do think he has that inside outside versatility. I mean, honestly, like he was a slot corner for a long time with the Patriots, but I think he was their number one like outside corner last year, basically in that system. And the Patriots had a fantastic pass defense last season, right? It was all the Joneses back there. They had a ton of rookies. They did a great job bringing those rookies along and making them starting quality players. But I think Jonathan Jones is a no-brainer, or at least target for the Vikings if he's willing to take a reasonable deal. He is 30 years old, so obviously he's up there a little bit on the older end of things. That's a little bit of a question. Another player I like in the free agent market, and I'm not sure he's a super great fit, but I do think from a physicality and mentality standpoint, he's a fit for the Vikings defense is Cameron Sutton, the slot corner from the Steelers, right? He's a physical run defense guy who just does a good job covering slot receivers, right? He's not going to be like a super twitched up slot corner like maybe a Tyrann Mathieu, right? Who was a havoc creator in his prime. But I think the physicality and the willingness to play inside is something that would definitely be an improvement over Chandon Sullivan from last year, right? So that's something for me. Another player who's worth mentioning at least is Nick Needham, right? Who was drafted by Flores for the Dolphins. The Patriots guys love their guys. Needham got some play. I don't think he's all that great, but he's a bargain basement option, and he at least knows the scheme and can help with the system if he's a depth piece on the team. Do you have any other names that stick out to you or anybody you want to talk about at the corner position, Nick?
I mean, I've always had a thing for Bryce Callahan as a slot guy,
Yes.
but he's um, you know, I feel like maybe he's over the hill or is no longer able to stay healthy. So I mean, you could throw out a lot of these guys. You could throw out like I like Marcus Peters, but Vikings probably aren't the people to gamble on somebody who's
Mm-hmm.
got some injury question marks too. So, but would be a good fit for the coming out of Baltimore and that whole system. I feel like in terms of man coverage, blitz heavy defenses, he's a fit there as well. So, but probably those names are probably not at the top of the list because the Vikings probably want somebody who can play slot because they don't have that, and or if there's outside somebody who is young and can be relied upon to be give like a solid upgrade because right now the Vikings have lots of young talent. But what they need is like somebody who can step in and give them a floor, I guess. Because right now we don't know if Andrew Booth is like a starting caliber player. As much as high as I was on him, well, based on his college tape, his pro tape was pretty ugly. Evans looked good, but he was still only a rookie, and I'm not sure you want to pen him in as your starter. And Dantzler as well. We're talking about a guy who got beat out by Caleb Evans for a lot of snaps. So I feel like they want somebody who gives them like a more of a sure quality thing if they get an outside corner. All that said, I feel like with the cap situation and the lack of slot corners on the roster, and the fact that Flores kind of values that versatility a little bit more than your average defensive coordinator because he wants nickels who can play the star position and can kind of blitz as well. I feel like they're more likely to invest there. So, yeah, it's a good list of guys though.
Yeah, absolutely. And one final piece to wrap this up. I do want to say I want the Vikings to bring Duke Shelley back. Like, I think he way outperformed our expectations for him last year, and I think he deserves the shot to compete once again to be a starting player on an NFL team. And I don't see why that shouldn't be with us, right? Because we have a pretty desperate need at the position. So I'm definitely willing to pay him a couple $1 million to play here. Right. I mean, I hope he gets more than that, right? Like, I want him to get as much as he wants because I loved his competitive attitude with the team last year. But I also hope we're able to keep him as a Viking next season. So
yeah, love Duke Shelley. And the Patriots system does not shy away from smaller, undersized cornerbacks, even though that's not the prototype for man corners. So that could be a very good. The thing I don't know about him is can he press? And I feel like that's a question with a lot of these guys is they're going to need to, if not necessarily jam, like deal with the physicality of being up on the line of scrimmage and dealing with guys who are releasing into their bodies and stepping on their toes. So I'm not sure. And we played so much shell off coverage last year. I'm not sure if Shelley's. I should also throw out Byron Jones. It's not clear if he's retiring or not, but if he's not, and the Vikings want to give him like a 1 year prove it contract, he would obviously be somebody who could reunite with Brian Flores and if he's healthy, which various reports maybe he's retiring or not, but if he's not, then if he's available, it would be a good fit based on what he did before the injuries.
yeah, I saw that, and I'm all in if he's medically cleared. It definitely sounds like, from a medical perspective, that's probably not going to happen. So he would be a really interesting piece, and obviously the Dolphins committed a lot to him. Now there is one other big domino in the league-wide NFL free agent market that dropped today. This is we're recording Tuesday evening. This is the last day for teams to put franchise tags on players. And there was only one franchise tag placed on. I'm sorry, all of the franchise tags that were placed were the non-exclusive franchise tag, which doesn't really matter because like 3 running backs were franchise tag, right? Nobody's paying 2 first-round picks for Saquon Barkley or Josh Jacobs, no matter how good you think they are. Nobody's paying 2 first-round picks for a tight end. The interesting part is Lamar Jackson, the Ravens quarterback, got franchise tagged with a non-exclusive franchise tag. This means that all the other teams in the NFL can negotiate with him. If they sign him into an offer sheet, the Ravens have the right of first refusal, which basically says, the Ravens can agree to exactly the contract another team agreed to with Lamar. But if the Ravens don't want that, the team would be able to send 2 first-round picks to get Lamar Jackson from the Ravens, right? So we've got a baseline of 2 first-round picks for acquiring Lamar Jackson, and a team could negotiate outside of that. But for the purposes of our discussion, let's assume it's 2 first-round picks, Nick, right? Do you think it's worthwhile for the Vikings to pursue Lamar Jackson for 2 first-round picks at any price, right? And that's the starting point. I guess it would have to be at least $32 million, but I think, if you're willing to spend 2 first-round picks, you're willing to spend at least the tag number, right? And then subsequently, how high are you willing to go for Lamar Jackson in terms of an overall contract cost and an overall guarantees, right? Because that's the big hang up with Lamar's contract negotiation with the Ravens from reporting, is that he wants a fully guaranteed deal. So what are you willing to do to get Lamar Jackson to the Vikings, or are you even willing to look into this in the first place?
Oh, I am absolutely. I mean, I'm a Lamar believer, so I know you are too, Matt. So,
Yeah.
but Vikings fans who have legitimate concerns about Lamar, this is not going to be necessarily the podcast for you. And I can acknowledge up front, he's played injuries. You worry about Will he have the same kind of career arc that Cam Newton did, where he was surrounded by limited talent, and then eventually that style of play was not able to carry him into his 30s or past his 30s. But at the same time, I feel like in similarity with Cam, and that MVP despite having not a lot of talent around him, and then injuries later on. So there's some similarities, but at the same time, like I just think Lamar is a top 5 quarterback in the NFL with the potential.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen him play at an MVP caliber level, and he's a significantly better passer than most people think. Yes, he's not the world's most accurate passer, but I feel like he's got solid accuracy and ability to read defenses, on top of otherworldly ability, creativity and ability to, he's an instant insert him and you will have a top 3 rushing offense with him simply by virtue of the fact that he's your quarterback. Not only does he allow you to be +1 in the run game all the time, he also forces defenses to play a lot more middle of the field closed against you. And if you go from pairing Lamar Jackson in Baltimore with absolutely no one to throw to other than no wide receivers to throw to. I mean, you got to give Mark Andrews his due, but going from no wide receivers to literally the best wide receiver in the league and the reigning offensive player of the year, you're talking about a team that, yes, there's a possibility for and this is the reason I'm so for it, is yes, there's a possibility that the bottom falls out, Lamar Jackson gets hurt. The Vikings team could be a significantly worse team with Lamar Jackson, but the Vikings could also be a team that are significantly more likely to win a Super Bowl with Lamar Jackson. And I feel like you get Lamar Jackson, you get somebody who we've already seen play at an MVP caliber level, and you take him from a supporting cast where things didn't work out, where he wasn't getting a lot of wide receiver help. You give him Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson, KJ Osborne, some of the other guys, Keenan McCardell can maybe develop somebody else. Behind the best offensive tackle duo in the NFL. That's a recipe for a team that can win Super Bowls, or at least an offense. You got to figure it out on the defensive side with Brian Flores has to hold up his end of the bargain. But yes, I would pay 2 first-round picks. I mean, it's one net first-round pick if you assume somebody will end up paying a first-round pick for Cousins, or maybe it's a second and a third or something. I can live with that. And then it's just a question of how much money do you pay him. And yes, I think he's the kind of a quarterback who you pay $45, $50 million a year to. And on the guarantees, I wouldn't give him $250 million. I wouldn't give him the Deshaun Watson contract, but I would be willing to get up there and guarantees. And what I would probably do is I would do the next year's salary guarantees by like the first week of the league year or whatever. It's a rolling guarantee basis, so that if the wheels fall off, if this turns into a Cam Newton situation, you have an out and you're not screwing the franchise over for the next decade. But I feel like there's enough risk. Yes, there's some risk there, but there's such incredible upside, and I feel like he would be such a substantial upgrade over Kirk Cousins, who I respect. I have a lot of respect for Kirk Cousins as a passer, but I feel like the Vikings with Lamar Jackson would become Super Bowl contenders over the life of that contract, and I would love to see the Vikings win a Super Bowl. I mean, that's the name of the game. So yes, I would do it.
Yeah, so just to rave about Lamar a little bit on my end here, like I think he's been underrated as a passer since he came out of school, right? I think you look at Lamar Jackson back when he was in Louisville, and he showed signs of a legitimate pocket presence. He showed legitimate accuracy and like good footwork and decision making there. Now there was accuracy things that he needed to clean up, and he's had some accuracy issues in the NFL. He's not as good of a pure passer as Kirk Cousins is, right? Like he doesn't put the ball exactly where he wants it to go every time, but he's a very good anticipatory passer. He has good NFL accuracy, right? Not great NFL accuracy. I'd argue Kirk has great NFL accuracy, but you take all of the other aspects of his game with his creation and with his running ability, and that just adds as a force multiplier. Like you said, I think he's a top 5 quarterback in the NFL. If you want to argue maybe like he's a fringe top 5, like he's definitely top 7, say, right? Like it, and that does assume he's healthy. He has had some injury issues. We've also found out some interesting information about the Ravens training staff in the last week, right? With that NFLPA report, which we didn't mention. And the Vikings have apparently are just awesome all around, right? They were basically ranked number 1 by a survey of the members of the NFLPA, aka, NFL players, right? And the Vikings were ranked number 1 in terms of facilities, how the team travels, the training staff, the strength coaches, that sort of thing. So that's an incredible kudos to the Vikings organization for doing that, right? You look at the way the Ravens training staff did, they were the worst graded training staff in the NFL, basically. So that's a pretty big concern for Lamar Jackson with the Ravens and maybe a contributor to his injuries recently. Obviously, you mentioned he lacked the supporting cast of wide receiver. He also, in my opinion, lacked the supporting cast from a passing game perspective and from a coaching perspective, right? Greg Roman has a very diverse run game. He's an excellent run game coordinator. He's been an excellent run game coordinator for a very long time, but he runs basically a high school passing offense. If you watch that Ravens passing offense, there are wide receivers going in the same area, running the same route constantly. They're running basic concepts that don't give Lamar a ton of options or give Lamar a ton of opportunity to beat the defenses he's going up against. So a lot of times Lamar's tasked with doing it by himself, and I think that's what leads to people kind of thinking Lamar isn't all that good of a passer, as opposed to, actually evaluating Lamar's natural ability as a player and the process of what he's doing on the field, which I think show that Lamar is actually an excellent quarterback. So all of those things being said, I'm willing to go up to $45 million a year. I'm willing to go up to I would say I'm willing to go up to $45 million a year fully guaranteed. I know that sounds a little bit insane, but I'm willing to do that. I'd rather have it on that rolling guarantee structure where it's a functional guarantee. And if something catastrophic does happen, yeah, maybe it sucks, but you have, you're screwed for 2 years instead of being screwed for 4 years, right? On that level of a contract. If it were $50 million, I don't think I'd want to do that fully guaranteed. A, I don't think you get the cap flexibility that you need at that point. But B, also, that's just so much money. And one of the points that's a critical point in this is the way NFL contracts work. Like, if you fully guarantee money to a player, that money the owner has to fork up right away and put in escrow to sit there. And I think that's something that teams are reluctant to do. Now, that's an outdated policy that I'd like to see the NFL change. I think that's something that's in the CBA, so it would require collective bargaining to do so. And honestly, I'm not really quite sure why it hasn't been done from that perspective yet, because I think it would make owners more willing to give out these contracts, right? Like, I think it's a nuisance to owners rather than a benefit to them, because while that money's sitting in escrow, they can't make money off of it elsewhere, which, as we know, for billionaires, like, that's like their primary goal with their money, is to make more money with it, right? So I think that I'd totally be for a Lamar contract extension. Is there something you wouldn't go to, Nick, in terms of a monetary value for Lamar?
I mean, honestly, you're not going to do something crazy, but no, I'm confident enough in Lamar Jackson's ability as a passer that I feel like if Jackson is asking for a Deshaun Watson contract, I feel like he's worth that caliber of contract. $250 million fully guaranteed. Like, I mean, yeah, there risk there, sure, but like also there's downside, but there's also a significantly greater chance at a Super Bowl,
Yeah.
which is the whole point. If you're willing to go to like 45 with Lamar Jackson, I feel like $5 million is not going to make or break your Super Bowl run. What is going to make or break it is going from Kirk Cousins, a statue in the pocket, to a guy who can turn pressures into touchdowns because he can make guys miss and do incredible things with the ball in his hands, and is also an underrated and I would say above average passer purely on a passing basis. And that's you have to evaluate both him and the system he was in, which hurt him from a passing perspective, and the wide receivers he was throwing to, which really hurt him. So I am very relative to most people. I'm very high on Lamar Jackson as a quarterback and as a passer. I acknowledge that there are injuries. I acknowledge that they're legitimate. I mean, a lot of the NFL is not interested in Lamar Jackson, curiously enough, and I think there's good reason for that. But I also feel like the upside is there, that I want to see the Vikings become a Super Bowl contender, and I think Lamar Jackson throwing to Justin Jefferson and friends is a Super Bowl contending offense. So I'm for it. And I think, like, yeah, first round picks are expensive, but like, look, 2 first round picks to trade up for Bryce Young or Anthony Richardson. Like, I would rather spend 2 first round picks to get the guy who you hope Bryce Young becomes in Lamar Jackson. And different prospects, obviously, or Anthony Richardson's different than Lamar Jackson, but like, Lamar is who you hope your number 1 overall pick becomes, and so you can get it right now and just have to pay them the money. But the surplus value you get out of an MVP caliber player playing at an MVP caliber level is well in excess. Like, nobody on the Chiefs is upset that they're paying Patrick Mahomes $45 million a year right now, and I think it'd be the same thing with Lamar Jackson if you got him into a better offense.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, and I don't think we're probably going to get much pushback from somebody who wants Anthony Richardson, who wants the Vikings to trade up for Anthony Richardson or C.J. Stroud or Bryce Young or somebody like that. I think the one thing you have to look at, and just the one thing I'd say on Kirk versus Lamar, is the Vikings have had Kirk Cousins for 5 seasons, right? We just went through an entire podcast over an hour talking about the difficult decisions the Vikings have to make because of the money we're paying Kirk Cousins, right? We've done this season after season after season for 5 years. It's something that we have solutions for, right? We've talked through a bunch of solutions for, but this team does have significant needs, and we need to do something to address those needs. If Kirk Cousins hasn't been able to elevate this team to be beyond somebody who's made a divisional round and gotten absolutely embarrassed by the San Francisco 49ers in that divisional round game, right? We got embarrassed by the Giants this year, losing that playoff game. And I don't think the Giants' playoff loss was Kirk Cousins' fault. It was clearly the defense's fault. But investing that much in Kirk Cousins and poor drafting, right? Poor drafting is part of it, but that takes time to overcome. We're going to need to draft successfully if we're going to be good with Kirk Cousins. We're also going to need to draft successfully if we're going to be good and win a Super Bowl with Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson is just a force multiplier to your offense over what Kirk Cousins is. I think that's the case for me with Lamar over Kirk Cousins on the Vikings, right? Like, why he's an upgrade over Kirk is his incredible running ability that, like you said, guarantees you a top 3 rushing offense. Like, you cannot not have a top 3 rushing offense with Lamar Jackson as your quarterback. I have a feeling, just because the running game dynamic of that quarterback running is so important, right? Look at the Bears with Justin Fields. You know, it's the same thing. So with that being said, with who we both agree that Lamar is as a passer, right, which is an above average player who I think was kind of hamstrung by the circumstances he was in Baltimore, I think it's pretty much a no-brainer that the Vikings should attempt to make this move. Now, there's a lot of realities that are difficult, right? Like, what if the Ravens are just baiting this to go out there and saying, all right, Lamar, we're basically going to call your bet, and we don't think you're going to get this much money on the open market. We'll match whatever somebody's willing to give you because we want to have you on your team. We just don't want to pay you what you were originally asking for, right? Like, that's a legitimate possibility if the Ravens are trying to do something like that with this tag. So at the end of the day, you know, I would love to see the Vikings go after Lamar Jackson. I don't think they're necessarily going to do it, but it's just a really interesting talking point, I think.
Yeah, it's fun to talk about. I fully expect the Vikings to not even be interested, but man can dream.
Yeah, exactly. And with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. Had a bit of a longer episode for y'all today. You know, but we've been off for a month, so it was good to get together, talk some ball, and chop it up with you, Nick. Any final thoughts before we sign off here?
No, I mean, we're going to have a lot of news coming out next week with the new league year starting and everything, and start of free agency next week. So hope to bring you more episodes on that. We still got the big Brian Flores defensive schematic deep dive coming at you as well. So keep your eyes posted for that. Hopefully we'll get some more podcasts out to you in the upcoming weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure we will have something soon after free agency opens, just discussing the Vikings' initial moves and kind of breaking down the players that they added on. So with that, I'm Matt Freese. You can find me at Fries Football. He's Nick Olson. You can find him at Nick Olson NFL. Our co-host is at You've Been Gregged. Kindred Skulls is the name of the podcast. You can find us at Kindred Skulls on Twitter. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts. And with that, Skull Vikings.
Skull. Actually, you cannot currently find me on Twitter because I'm taking a Twitter break. But
oh yes, Nick's taking a little bit of a Twitter hiatus, but it's been good for him probably. So
my mental health is better. You know, I've avoided the algorithm, so the algorithm's bad vibes. I'm free of those for now.
So. I'm not gonna lie, it gets worse every single day. It's just not a good place to be. But hey,
but we're addicted anyway.
That's exactly how it is. That's exactly how it is. And y'all listening to it are addicted too. Like, nobody's immune to this.
On that cheery note, goodbye. We love you.
Yeah.
Cool, baby.
The first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. And we'll all cheer on behind.